One key aspect of a proper gaming experience is to steep players into some type of power fantasy. And this goes beyond only games with some sort of combat, duking it out with groups of thugs with little more than your fists, or taking on giant monsters with a sword and maybe some moderate magic. Even something as down-to-earth as Harvest Moon still makes the player into a practically deific farmer, where no crop suddenly dies for seemingly no reason, pests are only a problem in cutscenes, and shops won't cheat you when buying up your crops. Of course, some games certainly dive into the power fantasy much harder than others. The Yakuza series is one that now has a special place in my heart for the types of games that lean into making the player feel like the hero of the story. There are few feelings better than walking up to a group of thugs, having them all insult Kiryu in some fundamental way, only to then beat them into the ground with the promotional sign from a nearby ramen shop. However, that isn't even where this aspect truly peaks in the world of gaming. That title has to go to the boomer shooter genre, one that has exploded over the years in the indie space, and has only really seen success in AAA development in one place: the return of Doom in 2016, and the following series after. I mean, there will probably be some comments arguing whether or not Doom 2016 and Eternal even count towards the boomer shooter genre, but for the sake of capturing the power fantasy the genre can provide, I submit evidence 32A. Almost as satisfying as mowing the lawn in Bloodborne. However, as satisfying as it is to be a powerhouse cleaving through enemies with little care for their presence besides their ability to push your momentum forward, what if we took all of that power and removed the fantasy? That's right. We're talking about how difficulty separates Dark Souls from the other casual No, actually, we're diverting a bit from my norm. Why? Because I've played a game and had such a blast that I want to talk about it for 20 minutes. And tell you all to go buy it, play it, beat it, and love it too. Today, we're talking about Ghost Runner, and how two simple omissions from the standard fare of boomer shooters should earn it a completely new genre title. I'll accept runner-like or ghost-like. Choose your favorite of the two in the comments. Small disclaimer, while I'll be saying Ghost Runner a lot as the ubiquitous title of the series, the footage you'll be watching from here on out will all be from Ghost Runner 2, the sequel released in October 2023. The reason I clarify is that both games play basically the same, but the sequel is a much smoother experience. So that's what all of my capture is going to be coming from. Anyway, back on topic. So, before we get into any deviations, let's look at the power side of the power fantasy formula that Ghost Runner commits hard to. Every enemy, with the exception of bosses, dies in exactly one hit. No matter how big, and no matter how strong they seem they should be, our protagonist Jack is able to slice them clean in half with a single swing. Perks of being a cyborg. Not an android, by the way, as the sequel establishes. To enhance that feeling of absolutely unmatched power, combat encounters are rarely one-on-one affairs, but instead pits Jack against 3 or more enemies at a time. At harder difficulties, that number can reach into the tens of enemies in one area, with Jack capable of stacking up his combo through every single one of them if the player is fast and skilled enough. Learning Encounter is all about seeing what walls, grapple points, and launch pads will take Jack where, and what order of those takes the best route from enemy to enemy. Then there's the movement itself, allowing Jack to run along walls, grind along rails, and grapple through the crunchy cyberpunk hellscape of Dharma Tower. That's all without talking about the motorcycle, which is apparently plug and play for Jack, even when blasting through cramped hallways filled with buzzsaws and roadblocks at 200 miles per hour. The power on display from Jack here is real, and succeeding at killing a room full of enemies, or running through a parkour section, or masterfully piloting a bike around obstacles makes the player feel powerful. So, with so much reverence I've shown for this power that Ghost Runner puts in the player's hands, how could I call it power without the fantasy? Well, that's because of the second half of the equation that I haven't focused on yet. See, from combat to parkour, there's always the risk of falling off a ledge, or getting shot, or stabbed, or ramming that shiny new bike into a barrier. Any of these options will kill Jack immediately. This is where the fantasy goes right out the window. Because while Doom, either 1993 or 2020, will punish players who can't rip and tear at high speeds, the genre of boomer shooters are much more forgiving than Ghost Runner on most difficulties. Even at its easiest, Ghost Runner gives no quarter, not even allowing a single mistake before Jack is reset to the start of an encounter and has to try the entire thing again, from start to finish. And then there are even more difficulties to find after beating the game on the baby easy mode that killed me nearly 100 times on the final boss alone. Although I think my total death count stacked up to more than triple that across the entire game. Then again, I'm not very careful and am more than willing to die 20 or more times to reach a secret item that's taunting me off in some dark corner. All the same, any idea of being the absolute most capable cyber ninja in the world is only as good as the attempts that succeed. It's somewhat akin to save skimming in Hitman until you get Silent Assassin. Never mind the various times you were caught and had to reload. What matters is the timeline where RNG worked perfectly and the player's inputs were on point from start to finish. That is the one that continues on to the next level, regardless of how many times it takes a player to get there. Fans of a certain top-down shooter might already be screaming a similar example of this exact type of combat that makes the player feel powerful while also making them incredibly squishy. To a certain degree, Hotline Miami might be a better host for the power minus fantasy genre. So no more Ghost-like. Maybe these should be Hot-likes? Miami-likes? Well, yeah, maybe if Ghost Runner was exactly like Hotline Miami, but that isn't entirely the case, is it? I mean, there's definitely still a level of inhuman fantasy at play here. No matter how squishy Jacket might be when stomping through mountains of mobsters and criminal undergrounds, he has exactly one ability that gives him an advantage over Jack. In most cases throughout Hotline Miami, Jacket has a bird's eye view of the world. You can see where all nearby enemies are at any time. There are a few instances where this complete view of the scenery is meddled with, but for the most part, players are given all of the information they need right from the start and can start their killing spree with all of that knowledge. This is where Ghost Runner makes its own mark, and ramps the difficulty up over Hotline Miami. While maps are generally open-ended, with multiple ways to look around and few enemies or other obstacles are completely hidden, the first-person perspective gives a limited view on each arena. Not only does this make completing an encounter on the first try more difficult because of the lack of knowledge of what might be around the next corner, it also means that Jack can't see when enemies are behind him and about to get a shot off while he isn't looking directly at them. It should be noted at this point that my commenting on Ghost Runner's difficulty is not an appraisal of the game with how hard it is to beat as a metric of quality. Games that offer a challenge can be fun and engaging, but an easy breeze through a fun story can be equally exciting. I don't know anyone who would call No Code's Observation a challenge, but it is easily one of the best games I've played in the last 5 years. On the opposite end, Lies of P might have launched as the most difficult Souls-like title ever, and it is my favorite entry in the genre, not made by From Software. Closely followed by the Surge series, so judge me on that as you see fit. Instead, the language of difficulty is simply the easiest way to show the dividing line between Ghost Runner and other similar games. These are differences in mechanics that cause the player to focus in different ways, which also happen to make the game more difficult. With that disclaimer out of the way, I haven't even mentioned the most obvious aspect of Ghost Runner's combat that continues to push this power without the fantasy style of gameplay. In all of the games that I have since compared it to, there has been one major difference. Whether it's the frantic clearing of apartments, nightclubs, and villas in Hotline Miami, or the bombastic rip and tear through Mars and Hell from Doom, the best comparable titles also include guns that can dominate enemies from a distance as long as they have ammo, even if throwing a bat is often better than firing a shotgun in most of Hotline Miami. Still, distance is always king with plentiful access to raining hot death at range. But not Ghost Runner. Guns aren't exactly Jack's style. Instead, he uses a katana, and occasionally a few shuriken with a minor amount of range, that even minor enemies are capable of dodging. This right here is the key to how developer One More Level has crafted an experience that gives a player all of the power without any of the fantasy. However, now that we've taken 10 minutes to define the runner-like genre and its unique twist on power fantasy, what else is there to say about it? Well, a bit. Not a ton, not for me at least, but a bit. And that has to do with the skill window, and how hitting, or at least striking close to the skill ceiling, can bring the fantasy rushing right back into the player's arms. That is because of one simple fact. Ghost Runner may be difficult to learn, but the tough bastard can absolutely be mastered. The following is cut together to give the illusion of prestige gameplay, given that I'm not a fan of using footage captured by other creators, and I'm also not even fucking close to good enough at Ghost Runner to beat an entire level without any deaths at all. But I've at least made it through to the end of both games and have accrued enough skill to slap together something that looks at least halfway comparable to high-level execution. That being said, playing at this level is entirely possible, and some of the game's top speedrunners like Passiflora, Bladen, and Blade LMAO have all beaten Ghost Runner 2 in a little under an hour. Although the game hasn't even been out for an entire year, so chances are high that sub 50-minute runs will be cropping up once the next major skip is found. And I certainly wouldn't doubt the speedrunning and glitch hunting communities for their ability to keep finding new skips all the time. I mean, hell, it took the Breath of the Wild community like 4 years to discover BLS sliding. So I wouldn't consider it a speedrun out of Steam quite yet. Still, why am I showing off the best that little old not speedrunning me can manage to perform? Well, to show that like many of the games that have earned the title of most difficult out there, think your Ninja Gaidens, Cupheads, and of course Dark Souls, the trick of getting good is rarely about earning some magical muscle memory. It always comes down to one thing: knowledge. In a case that I can make with some confidence, Elden Ring is potentially one of the easiest games that From Software has ever made. Not because the bosses aren't as difficult as Dark Souls 1 through 3, in fact they're much harder. And not because the player controls are sharper and snappier than ever before. That one is actually entirely true though. But because across the open world is a vast toolkit for players to uncover. However, for anyone who already knows where the optimal pieces of their build are, Elden Ring can be steamrolled from the any percent to the all remembrances. On top of that is the knowledge of those bosses themselves, their movesets, the timings needed to dodge their attacks, and most importantly, the openings with which the player can strike back without eating a hit in response. This knowledge is there in Ghost Runner as well, coming again in two forms. The first and most obvious is the placement of enemies and traversal points. As mentioned before, when the player is first dropped into a fight, they aren't really given all of the information up front. Instead, they get a first-person view of the room and have to evaluate the best course of action from there. In plenty of cases, these locations can be beaten on the first try with some quick reflexes and some spatial awareness. However, some of the hardest levels will take time, patience, and practice to learn where every threat is, how close Jack can get to them before they become a real problem, and the best ways to remove them from the equation before taking that single hit and needing to reset the entire encounter. It is a process that can feel like it takes forever. Although in reality, it's usually no more than a few minutes. As players look for optimal routes, figure out when and where they can use cover as an advantage, and get in close enough to finally make that hit against each and every enemy. Once the player has learned a good enough route to take, and is finally able to execute on it well enough to complete the encounter, the whole thing starts to feel less like an action slasher and more like a rhythm game. It's actually funny how often that tends to happen in games like Ghost Runner. This similar accusation has been impressed upon Sekiro in the past, as well as a number of other extremely difficult titles. When broken down into a raw feeling and a rote resuscitation of learned actions, everything suddenly becomes a matter of rhythm. That's one reason why authors, especially those of us in the sci-fi and fantasy realms, tend to equate combat between two skilled combatants to a dance. It's as if there's no other way to present it in media. When you realize that, then the flashing lights and cyborg ninjas all start to fall away. Every game has a rhythm, a pulse by which its heart beats, and tuning into that rhythm can take an exceptionally difficult challenge from impossible to second nature. Passing into the flow state where the player and the game become one, pulsing together, that is the second form of knowledge that is required for mastering Ghost Runner. An understanding of the beat of the game and the ability to get in tune with it, that can turn the clanky metal-on-metal combat into music. Interestingly enough, Ghost Runner 2 even included a place to master that aspect of the game as well, to uncover that knowledge without being hampered by already knowing the layout of every level. Like many a AAA title before it, Ghost Runner 2 introduced a roguelike mode that takes the already intense combat and parkour and adds in a hint of procedural generation in order to keep players from simply memorizing every encounter. This is where the skill ceiling is set, at the very top of the most difficult Rogue Runner courses, which I will likely never manage to even come close to. Yeah, I struggle with Stage 1, let alone the extreme hardcore versions available late in the endgame. My own inability to scratch at the skill ceiling aside, it is very clearly there, marked with the highest difficulty stage of Rogue Runner, with all of the challenges it brings. Then there's the challenges that players might set on themselves, as opposed to those set by the developers on Jack. See, it is possible to scrape by the final levels of the roguelike segments, with barely any lives left and using every last chance and upgrade at your disposal to reach the end goal. However, there's also the possibility of getting through without much resistance at all, walking away with lives to spare, or even more impossible sounding, making your way through the end of the final stage without having ever been hit a single time, without ever falling into the void below, without even a single failure. Playing the game perfectly. Once you've done it, once you've managed to come within spitting distance of that ceiling, once you've done the impossible and beaten everything the game has to offer without ever being caught off guard, there's only one more question to ask. Can I do that even faster now? The answer? Definitely. Amazingly enough, up there at the top of the skill ceiling, up where I can see a pinnacle of a game that I'll never reach myself, one more level has hidden something. See, I lied at the start of this video, to a degree. When I claimed that Ghost Runner is all of the power with none of the fantasy, and I've since repeated that claim more than a few times now. However, it isn't entirely true, because Ghost Runner is not missing the fantasy has been restricted, withheld, or otherwise obscured. One more level gave us all the power, granted us control of Jack and his infinitely sharp, unbreakable, instant-killing katana. But they left the fantasy out of reach and told us to go get it. Because what's the best power fantasy we can get in our modern society? Is it slicing through a tower filled with gangsters, mechs, and experiments gone wrong? Well, honestly, for most of us, and especially those of us who like to post about our accomplishments online, the best feeling of power comes from beating the hard game perfectly. Before I see you soon, it's time for some Patreon shoutouts. Our patrons receive special rewards as we continue to make content here at DevBox. This includes getting early access to videos, having your name in the credits here, and for those who pledge $5 or more, they'll get their names read out loud, such as Azul. Thanks for helping to support the channel so we can keep looking into our favorite games. See you soon.